but it showed that the Syrians were waiting for this attack. What could have been a lot more effective had they deployed it was the Russian S-400 anti-aircraft missile battery based over here on the western coast, not that far from Cyprus, actually, in Latakia. That could have been lethal had the Russians decided to retaliate. They didn't. I think they didn't want to exacerbate the situation, inflame the situation any further. And as it was, the missiles landed where they were fired at. The Americans and the British and the French believe it was a successful operation.
All right, Alistair, thank you very much indeed. Alistair Bunkle there with new detail and new reporting on last night's attack. Lots more still to come from Washington. Stay with us here on Sky News.
Bit of sport for you now, though, and let's head straight to the Premier League. 4 games taking place at the moment, and already lots of goals, nowhere more so than at Selhurst Park. A hugely significant game down at the bottom. No love lost between these two sides, and Crystal Palace got off to a great start because Wilf Zaha and James Tompkins put them 2-0 up. Glenn Murray did pull one back against his former club, but Wilf Zaha has just restored Crystal Palace's 2-goal advantage. If that stays as it is, then Palace will be 6 points clear of the relegation zone. Brighton already 7 points clear of the relegation zone, so looking okay for them. Burnley 2-0 up. That's kind of the battle for 7th. It could mean a Europa League place. 2 goals in that one for Burnley. They came from Chris Wood and from Kevin Long, so they would be 9 points clear of Leicester if that was to remain the same. Elsewhere, still goalless between Huddersfield and Watford, and still goalless between Swansea and Everton as well. In the early kickoff, which you can see there, Southampton missed the chance to move out of the relegation zone. They threw away a 2-goal lead to lose 3-2 at home to Chelsea. Dusan Tadic and Jan Bednarek had put Southampton ahead, but 2 goals from Olivier Giroud and 1 for Eden Hazard in 9 minutes saw them snatch victory. Chelsea now 7 points off the top 4 spot. Could be a big day in the Championship as well. Let's have a look at some of the games there, and that one at the top is huge, because if that stays the same, Gary Gardner has put Barnsley 1-0 up against Bolton, then Barnsley would leapfrog Bolton out of the relegation zone. That match too, Burton against Derby, hugely significant result. Not so much for Burton, who are kind of doomed at the bottom of the table, but for Derby, who are chasing the playoffs, that would be a costly defeat if that were to stay the same. Wednesday 1-0 up at Hull and Middlesbrough. If they were to win that match, then they would jump into the playoff places. So Middlesbrough hoping for victory against Bristol City in that one, but still plenty of time to go. Let's head up to Scotland, where Motherwell are through to their first Scottish Cup final in 7 years. They beat Aberdeen 3-0, Curtis Main scoring twice at Hampden Park, including this fine solo effort from the halfway line. Motherwell will play either Celtic or Rangers in the final. They play tomorrow. Sebastian Vettel took his 2nd successive Formula 1 pole as Lewis Hamilton struggled in qualifying for the Chinese Grand Prix. It's an all-Ferrari front row again, with Vettel alongside Kimi Raikkonen. Hamilton could only manage 4th behind Mercedes teammate Valtteri Bottas. Katie Walsh, Bryony Frost and Rachel Blackmore will all try to become the first woman to ride a Grand National winner today. It's the first time since 1988 that there have been 3 women jockeys in the race.
It's very hard to get a ride in a national. It's very hard to get a ride in Cheltenham. It's very hard to get a ride at the big stage. So, you know, this race is a race that we've been dreaming about since we were kids. I mean, I'm sure Rachel's the same. We built fence in the back garden and jumped around, and we've won nationals in our heads more times than anything else. So, yeah, so to take part in it and to have the girls, Rachel and Bryony, in the ladies' room as well, there'd be a great bit of sport.
5:15 for the Grand National from Aintree this afternoon, and all the day's football across on Sky Sports News. You can keep across that.
Welcome back to Washington. President Trump, Theresa May and President Macron have confirmed that the action targeted specific sites associated with the Syrian government's chemical weapons programme. Theresa May told a news conference this morning that the action was right and legal.
Last night, British, French and American armed forces conducted coordinated and targeted strikes to degrade the Syrian regime's chemical weapons capability and deter their use. For the UK's part, 4 RAF Tornado GR4s launched Storm Shadow missiles at a military facility some 15 miles west of Homs, where the regime is assessed to keep chemical weapons in breach of Syria's obligations under the Chemical Weapons Convention. While the full assessment of the strike is ongoing, we are confident of its success. Let me set out why we have taken this action. Last Saturday, up to 75 people, including young children, were killed in a despicable and barbaric attack in Douma, with as many as 500 further casualties. We have worked with our allies to establish what happened, and all the indications are that this was a chemical weapons attack. We have seen the harrowing images of men, women and children lying dead with foam in their mouths. These were innocent families who, at the time this chemical weapon was unleashed, were seeking shelter underground in basements. First-hand accounts from NGOs and aid workers have detailed the most horrific suffering, including burns to the eyes, suffocation and skin discoloration, with a chlorine-like odour surrounding the victims. And the World Health Organization has received reports that hundreds of patients arrived at Syrian health facilities on Saturday night with signs and symptoms consistent with exposure to toxic chemicals. We are also clear about who was responsible for this atrocity. A significant body of information, including intelligence, indicates the Syrian regime is responsible for this latest attack. I cannot tell you everything, but let me give an example of some of the evidence that leads us to this conclusion. Open source accounts allege that a barrel bomb was used to deliver the chemicals. Multiple open source reports claim that a regime helicopter was observed above the city of Douma on the evening of the 7th of April. The opposition does not operate helicopters or use barrel bombs. And reliable intelligence indicates that Syrian military officials coordinated what appears to be the use of chlorine in Douma on the 7th of April. No other group could have carried out this attack. Indeed, Daesh, for example, does not even have a presence in Douma. And the fact of this attack should surprise no one. We know that the Syrian regime has an utterly abhorrent record of using chemical weapons against its own people. On the 21st of August 2013, over 800 people were killed and thousands more injured in a chemical attack also in Ghouta. There were 14 further smaller-scale chemicals attacks prior to that summer. At Khan Sheikhoun on the 4th of April last year, the Syrian regime used sarin against its people, killing around 100 with a further 500 casualties. And based on the regime's persistent pattern of behaviour and the cumulative analysis of specific incidents, we judge it highly likely both that the Syrian regime has continued to use chemical weapons since then and will continue to do so. This must be stopped. We have sought to do so using every possible diplomatic channel, but our efforts have been repeatedly thwarted both on the ground and in the United Nations. Following the sarin attack in eastern Damascus back in August 2013, the Syrian regime committed to dismantle its chemical weapon programme, and Russia promised to ensure that Syria did this, overseen by the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. But these commitments have not been met. A recent report from the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons has said that Syria's declaration of its former chemical weapons programme is incomplete. This indicates that it continues to retain undeclared stocks of nerve agent or precursor chemicals and is likely to be continuing with some chemical weapons production. The OPCW inspectors have investigated previous attacks and on 4 occasions decided that the regime was indeed responsible. And on each occasion, when we have seen every sign of chemical weapons being used, any attempt to hold the perpetrators to account has been blocked by Russia at the UN Security Council, with 6 such vetoes since the start of 2017. Just this week, the Russians vetoed a draft resolution that would have established an independent investigation into this latest attack, even making the grotesque and absurd claim that it was staged by Britain. So we have no choice but to conclude that diplomatic action on its own will not be any more effective in the future than it has been in the past. Over the last week, the UK government has been working intensively with our international partners to build the evidence picture and to consider what action we need to take to prevent and deter future humanitarian catastrophes caused by chemical weapons attacks. When the Cabinet met on Thursday, we considered the advice of the Attorney General, the National Security Advisor, and the Chief of the Defence Staff, and we were updated on the latest assessment and intelligence picture. And based on this advice, we agreed that it was both right and legal to take military action, together with our closest allies, to alleviate further humanitarian suffering by degrading the Syrian regime's chemical weapons capability and deterring their use. This was not about interfering in a civil war, and it was not about regime change. As I discussed with President Trump and President Macron, it was a limited, targeted and effective strike with clear boundaries that expressly sought to avoid escalation and did everything possible to prevent civilian casualties. Together, we have hit a specific and limited set of targets. They were a chemical weapons storage and production facility, a key chemical weapons research centre, and a military bunker involved in chemical weapons attacks. Hitting these targets with the force that we have deployed will significantly degrade the Syrian regime's ability to research, develop and deploy chemical weapons. A year ago, after the atrocity at Khan Sheikhoun, the US conducted a strike on the airfield from which the attack took place, but Assad and his regime hasn't stopped their use of chemical weapons. So last night's strikes by the US, UK and France were significantly larger than the US action a year ago and specifically designed to have a greater impact on the regime's capability and willingness to use chemical weapons. And this collective action sends a clear message that the international community will not stand by and tolerate the use of chemical weapons. I also want to be clear that this military action to deter the use of chemical weapons does not stand alone. We must remain committed to resolving the conflict at large. The best hope for the Syrian people remains a political solution. We need all partners, especially the regime and its backers, to enable humanitarian access to those in desperate need, and the UK will continue to strive for both. But these strikes are about deterring the barbaric use of chemical weapons in Syria and beyond. And so to achieve this, there must also be a wider diplomatic effort, including the full range of political and economic levers, to strengthen the global norms prohibiting the use of chemical weapons, which have stood for nearly a century. Although of a much lower order of magnitude, the use of a nerve agent on the streets of the UK in
Hi, I'm Hannah Stott with the latest showbiz news. A warning, some flash photography is coming up. Reality television star Khloe Kardashian has given birth to her first child after years of documenting her fertility struggles on her family's television show Keeping Up with the Kardashians. Kardashian is reported to have had a baby girl in a hospital outside Cleveland, Ohio early on Thursday morning. The cast of Marvel Studios' Avengers Infinity War have met South Korean fans during a red carpet event in Seoul. Benedict Cumberbatch, Tom Hiddleston and Tom Holland walked the red carpet while taking pictures with fans and signing autographs.
Consensus that chemical weapons cannot be used. This action is absolutely in Britain's national interest. The lesson of history is that when the global rules and standards that keep us safe come under threat, we must take a stand and defend them. That is what our country has always done, and that is what we will continue to do.
Theresa May, the Prime Minister there, speaking in the wake of last night's attack in which Britain supported America and France. Joining me now from Westminster is the SNP Defence spokesman, Stuart MacDonald. Thank you very much indeed for joining me, Mr MacDonald. You heard the Prime Minister there. Do you back these strikes? Do you support the Prime Minister?
No, I don't. I think she's done an incredibly dangerous thing in an incredibly dangerous way. To have sidelined Parliament, respond in this way to a war that was essentially announced on Twitter by the US President, I think is a bad day for parliamentary accountability, but worse than that, a really bad day for the conflict and for the people of Syria. This does nothing to help bring it to an end. In fact, if anything, it has the potential to make it all the worse.
Well, I mean, these were very limited strikes. They had a very limited aim, and they appear to have been carried off successfully. What would you have done?
I think there's no question that they've managed to target where it is they wish to target. Earlier this week, I wrote to the Prime Minister outlining to her some of the non-lethal alternatives that she could have used, urging her not to rush into this in the way that she has done. But crucially, she should be banging heads together at the UN Security Council and amongst the parties involved to get the Geneva talks started up again. So there are other options that can help do what she wants to do, which is to degrade the chemical abilities of the Assad government, but she didn't have to go about it in this extremely dangerous and rushed fashion.
Well, with the greatest respect, I mean, the Geneva talks are going nowhere and will go nowhere while President Assad and the Russians are winning this civil war. It seems to me you would just not respond to children and women and others getting killed by chemical weapons.
No, I was as horrified as the next person is to see those images from last weekend. They will remain with us forever. The use of chemical weapons can never be allowed to become normal. The question is, how do you respond? Now, if the aim is to degrade the
Mr MacDonald, with the greatest respect, I've got to interrupt you. I'm very sorry. The ambassador at the UN is speaking. Very sorry.
Weapons storage and production facility, a key chemical weapons research centre, and a military bunker involved in chemical weapons attacks. Hitting these targets with the force that we have deployed will significantly degrade the Syrian regime's ability to research, develop and deploy chemical weapons. This collective action sends a clear message that the international community will not stand by and will not tolerate the use of chemical weapons. Looking ahead, the United Kingdom, for our part, remains committed to working with our partners in the Council to resolve the conflict through a political solution. There must be a wider diplomatic effort, including the full range of political and economic levers, to strengthen the global norms prohibiting use of chemical weapons, which have stood for nearly a century. We cannot allow the use of chemical weapons to become normalised, whether that is in Syria or on the streets of Salisbury. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions.
What proportion is it estimated of the chemical weapons infrastructure that Syria has that was destroyed or degraded last night? Is there any sense of that?
Well, I think there will be separate military briefings coming later from the three capitals involved, so I will allow that to take place. But I will tell you that it was a limited strike with a targeted objective, and I think that's a very important factor.
Ambassador,
so I'm going to take this person first.
You've touched upon this in your remarks, but could you spell out for us the legal basis for these strikes?
Well, I will set that out in the Council in full. We have published it on our website here in New York, and it has been published by the government in London on the government website. But in a nutshell, it was to alleviate the humanitarian suffering of the people of Syria, which has been exacerbated by the use of chemical weapons. In the British government's view, in truly exceptional circumstances, it is right to have a humanitarian exemption, and international law does not prohibit this where it is to alleviate humanitarian distress, particularly on the scale we have seen in Syria.
Ambassador, should we wait any new strikes in Syria?
I'm sorry?
Should we wait any new strikes?
I don't have any comment to make on further strikes.
Ambassador, President Trump said he was considering a sustained response, that they would strike again if chemical weapons were used again. Is Britain on board with that as well?
We stand full square with President Trump and President Macron. This is a P3 action. We will stay in very close touch with our allies about next steps.
Ambassador, the Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, has questioned the legality of these strikes. You are certain about the legality?
Yes, we are certain. Thank you for asking, but the government is very certain. Thank you very much.
Well, there we are. That was Karen Pierce, the British ambassador to the UN. And I think we can go back. We rudely interrupted him. The defence spokesman for the SNP, Stuart McDonald. Mr McDonald, I'm very sorry to interrupt you, but I hope you heard what Karen Pierce had to say. We cannot allow the use of chemical weapons to be normalised. And isn't that the fundamental point here, that Britain had to act and act quickly?
Well, on not allowing them to become normalised, the ambassador and I are on the exact same page. There's no disagreement about that. The question is, how should the government have responded, if it should have responded at all? Now, I am of the view that there were non-lethal options open to the government. I spelled those out in a letter to the Prime Minister earlier this week. They would also have helped to degrade the ability of the Syrian government to use, to produce, to transport chemical weapons and use them in the way that they evidently have. But I also question the fact that the Prime Minister has rushed into this action and that she's sidelined Parliament in the way that she has. The public expect Parliament to do a job, but the government is hampering our ability to do a job. I want to have this debate in Parliament, not in TV studios and in front of TV cameras. She needs to accept that she is accountable to Parliament. Despite her being only a minority government, she's got tough questions to answer on Monday when we return.
Well, she didn't exactly rush into this. I mean, there was 6 days. Last time, it was about 3 days before Donald Trump launched the strikes. She had 6 days. Parliament wasn't sitting, and this was a very limited strike.
Parliament could have been recalled. There was no reason why it couldn't be recalled. We asked for it to be recalled so we could sit today to discuss this issue and have a vote on it. So I'm afraid that doesn't stack up. But in terms of the timing of this, she absolutely has rushed. There is no evidence to suggest that another chemical weapons attack was imminent. So I'm at a loss as to understand why she's felt the need to do it as quickly as she has done. So either she could have recalled Parliament or she could have waited until we returned on Monday. I'm afraid she's behaved in a rather terrible fashion, trying to avoid parliamentary scrutiny and parliamentary accountability. I and other colleagues across the opposition will be looking to force a debate on this next week when we return, with the possibility of a vote of some kind, because that's what the public would expect of us.
OK, Mr McDonald, thank you very much indeed for joining us. And now we can join Stuart Ramsey, our chief correspondent, who's in Kobani in northern Syria, and also Mark Stone, who is in Beirut. Stuart, first of all, to you, what has been the reaction there in northern Syria to these strikes?
I think just generally that they expected it to happen perhaps in some shape or form, but that nothing really has changed and that the war here is going to go on. I think it's quite clear from the Assad regime that as far as they're concerned, they will carry out further attacks, particularly perhaps in Idlib, which is the biggest stronghold left to the opposition, and that they will be carrying out those attacks, perhaps now holding back on use of chemical weapons. Well, there's no guarantees of that, as we've been hearing that all the facilities have gone, but they'll certainly be using their barrel bombs and artillery and planes again, and there's thousands and thousands of civilians who will definitely be affected in this ongoing civil war. And what has happened last night hasn't changed that one bit. I think people basically saying, well, that is a limited strike. It hasn't changed anything at all. Things will perhaps get even worse, and we know that Russia's going to continue to support the regime, as is Iran. So really, I think a lot of questions are going to be asked is, OK, well, as soon as chemicals are used, there's discussion about it and we draw a red line, etc., etc. But actually, nobody's really getting to the point of saying, how are we going to stop what is going on here? There is much talk about there needs to be diplomacy and discussions between the governments. But at the moment, that isn't happening. In fact, quite the opposite. So it's business as usual. Bashar al-Assad says he'll continue to fight what he calls extremists and jihadists, and he's going to go after everyone, particularly, as I say, in Idlib, and there will be thousands more people heading for the border and probably thousands more being killed as well. So really nothing much changed here, and I'm pretty much anyone who lives here was expecting it to stay exactly as it is.
So Mark, in Beirut, nothing much changed, says Stuart, and that's probably true. Are people in Lebanon surprised about the limited nature of the military strike last night?
Yes, I think there was an expectation, a fear even, that the strikes could be much larger. And had they been, of course, and if they had been on a broader degree of targets, then it could have affected the region's stability more broadly. Don't forget that fighting alongside and with the Syrian government and Bashar al-Assad are not only Iranian forces, but also Hezbollah militia from here in Lebanon, a key player in Lebanon. They are in force in great numbers over the border in Syria. Damascus is only 50 or so miles away from here. They are helping Bashar al-Assad regain control of his country alongside the Iranians and the Russians. Had the strikes been broader in terms of the targets they hit, had the coalition decided to hit, well, Russian targets maybe, but Iranian targets and Hezbollah targets, then that could have affected the wider region, could perhaps have meant that Hezbollah would attack America's ally on the southern border here with Israel. It could have really affected the stability of the broader region. So, yes, it's a surprise that the attacks, or that the coalition counterattack was so limited, but relief, I think, that it was limited. In terms of what exactly the point of it was, well, I've been speaking to a chemical weapon expert over the past few hours who's described the mission itself and has described the fact that they've targeted these specific 3 sites, 2 up in Homs, about 90 miles northeast of here, 1 in just outside Damascus, targeting them with high explosives, which clearly have to make sure that they don't just disseminate and disperse the chemical weapons that the coalition believes are there, but that they, the explosives that are used are of such high explosive that they simply destroy what it is that is there. So this is a very limited operation that is countering Bashar al-Assad's ability to carry out chemical attacks, although I'm told that his chlorine stocks, which is a very basic, crude chemical weapon, are almost limitless. So the ability of these strikes to stop chlorine attacks is, well, it's certainly in question. And all the while in America and in the UK there is debate about whether or not it was right to attack in response to a chemical weapon attack, there is a debate in Russia and indeed in Damascus. They are insisting still that this wasn't an attack, that the whole chemical weapon attack, that the whole thing was fabricated.
All right, Mark Stone in Lebanon and Stuart Ramsey there in Kobani in northern Syria. Thank you very much indeed. Well, stay with us on Sky News because we'll be going to the United Nations Security Council. This is a meeting called by the Russians, and they want a motion, a vote, condemning the action last night taken by the Americans with the French and the British in support. Stay with us on Sky News.
This is Sky News at 4 o'clock. The headlines. The US, UK and France launched multiple missiles on 3 targets in an early morning operation targeting suspected chemical weapons sites.
A short time ago, I ordered the United States Armed Forces to launch precision strikes on targets associated with the chemical weapons capabilities of Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad.
The US military says it's confident it has crippled President Assad's chemical capability, but that there are further sites. Theresa May says it was right and legal to take action despite the Labour leader calling it legally questionable.
We would have preferred an alternative path, but on this occasion there is none. We cannot allow the use of chemical weapons to become normalised, either within Syria, on the streets of the UK or elsewhere.
Russia has referred the US, the UK and France to the United Nations. We'll be live in New York as the Security Council meets this hour. You're watching Sky News. A very good afternoon to you. We are bringing you the news about the missile strikes on Syria taken by the Allies, led by the United States, the UK and France overnight. Questions being raised about the legality of that position. Jeremy Corbyn describing it as legally questionable. We're joined now from Westminster by the Conservative Party chair, Brandon Lewis. A very good afternoon to you, Mr. Lewis.
Good afternoon.
Your response to Jeremy Corbyn's claim that this action was legally questionable?
Well, don't accept that at all. As the Prime Minister outlined, this was legally correct. We've published the Attorney General's opinion on that, satisfying the legal requirements. And importantly, this was the right thing to do, a very targeted, very specific operation that's in the national security interest.
What about his secondary point that taking this action without putting it to Parliament makes real accountability for war crimes taking place in Syria? It makes that much harder.
Well, actually, I don't agree with that at all. Parliament's job is to hold government to account, and it will do that. The Prime Minister will be speaking to Parliament on Monday, but it's absolutely right that we had the Cabinet meeting on Thursday and the Prime Minister has taken a decision that's in the national interest, bearing in mind the operational security and safety of the mission and indeed the safety and security of our own armed forces who are putting themselves at risk and those of our allies. Absolutely the right thing to do.
Well, we waited more than 6 days after the attack in Douma. Why not wait until Monday and hold a vote?
Well, I'm sure that most of your viewers will appreciate that with all of these kind of operations, they are very finely tuned. It's right that they are properly planned out and they are timed, crucially timed correctly to be able to have the right impact with the right safety and security for all of those involved in the mission and to get the right outcome, which was that very targeted, very specific intent to degrade and deter the use of chemical weapons, something that has been deterred for some 100 years and we've got to make sure never becomes a norm in this planet and in war.
Jeremy Corbyn's also accused the Prime Minister of trailing behind Donald Trump, is she?
This is a tripartite action with our partners and allies in both France and the United States, one that's been welcomed. Let me just finish. One that's been welcomed by leaders around the world, and it is right that having brought together the international community over the last few weeks, as the Prime Minister has done, in outrage at the attack we saw in Salisbury, it is absolutely right that we also play our part in doing the right thing humanitarianly for the people of Syria as well.
There have been dozens of chemical attacks already in Syria. Why is this one all of a sudden so important?
Well, I think this one actually did highlight yet again that despite having agreed to not use chemical weapons after the attack in 2013, Syria has continued to do so. We saw in the last period that awful attack in Douma with 75 people, well, up to 500 people being affected, and there is reason to believe that the Syrian authorities and regime would use it again. So it's absolutely right that we took the right action on humanitarian grounds, very specific, very targeted, to deter and downgrade that use and ability to use chemical weapons in the future.
But we heard from the Pentagon that while it did take out some of these chemical weapons facilities, it hasn't destroyed all of them. So really, what was the point?
Well, as I said, and as the Prime Minister outlined herself this morning quite rightly, that this action was about degrading the ability to use chemical weapons and deterring their use, and a message from the international community that the use of chemical weapons in the modern world is completely unacceptable, as it has been for the last 100 years. We must not allow that to become the norm. But as we've also said, that wider issue in Syria, the challenges and the problems that we see in Syria more generally are ones that have got to find a political solution. And it's right that we continue to be not just the second largest bilateral supporter of those in most vulnerable need in Syria, but also pushing for that political, peaceful solution in the long term to the wider issues that Syria faces.
How do you find that peaceful solution, as you describe it, in a war which many people are saying Assad has already won?
We've got to continue the work with our allies internationally to put pressure on Syria and indeed the Russians to find a political and peaceful solution. But that does not deter us from making it very clear that the use of chemical weapons is abhorrent and unacceptable, and we will do what we need to do to deter and degrade the use of them, as these specific strikes have done.
Now, the United Nations Security Council is sitting down to meet as we speak at Russia's request. What can we expect from that, do you think?
Well, I would hope that at the end of that we'll see a continued unified support of the action taken by ourselves with our allies, as we've seen this afternoon, from leaders ranging from Angela Merkel to New Zealand to Donald Tusk, right across the world, all coming out and saying that this is an understandable, correct and properly specific and targeted thing to do. It was a difficult decision, these things always are, but we've got to do what is right in the national interest and indeed in humanitarian causes.
What can we expect to hear from the Prime Minister on Monday?
Well, Prime Minister will outline to Parliament on Monday the decision process that she took and the reasoning and the outlining the reasoning, as she did this morning to the public of this country, for these very specific and targeted attacks, working with our allies, as I say, to deter and downgrade and degrade the use of chemical weapons in Syria.
The Russian Foreign Minister has also described these acts as illegal. Your response to that?
Well, as our legal opinion makes clear, we believe this was legal, appropriate, targeted and proportionate response to what we have seen.
OK, Brandon Lewis, very good to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
We're just going to show you now the live pictures from New York. This is the United Nations Security Council about to start that meeting, that emergency meeting, which is being held at Russia's request. We will, of course, be bringing you more on that as soon as that meeting gets underway. But in the meantime, we're going to go to Moscow and talk to our correspondent, Lisa Holland, who is there for us. Lisa, Russia, we're very low-key response from President Putin so far, but Sergei Lavrov has described these acts as illegal.
Yes, and I think that tells you where the Russians are going on this. As you say, Sam, we've had a statement from the President Vladimir Putin, but we haven't seen him in person. I'm told that that's not anything we could particularly read into, in that he's probably trying to pitch himself as above all this. Russia, he will say, has got absolutely nothing to do with any chemical weapons attacks, so he probably wouldn't want to try and drag himself into it in that respect. But Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, saying that essentially Britain, America and France have committed an illegal act, and that is why they have called this emergency session of the UN Security Council. They say that those three countries had no mandate to act. Now, essentially, what we're going to see over the course of the next however many hours is really nothing more than a talking shop. It's going to be a platform for the Russians to vent their frustration and their anger. Worth reminding ourselves that just a few days ago, back at the UN in New York, the Russians blocked a resolution which would have allowed the UN to carry out an inquiry into an attack in Duma, but also the UN then would have been able to report back on it. Now, that was something that they didn't want to happen, so the Russians blocked that. They tried to bring about a resolution of their own, which wouldn't have drawn any conclusions over who was responsible. So having blocked those resolutions at the UN Security Council, they've turned back to the UN Security Council today to get this platform, and we are now about to hear from the session as it opens.
OK, we're going to take you to New York now, where that United Nations Security Council meeting has just started getting underway. Let's listen in.
I've been following closely the reports of airstrikes in Syria conducted by the United States, France and the United Kingdom. Last night, at 22 hours of New York, the US President announced the beginning of airstrikes with participation by France and the UK, indicating they were targeting the chemical weapons capabilities of the Syrian government and to deter their future use. His statement was followed by announcements from Prime Minister May and President Macron. The airstrikes were reportedly limited to 3 military locations inside Syria. The first target included the Syrian Scientific Studies and Research Center at Al-Mazaa Airport in Damascus. The second, an alleged chemical weapons storage facility west of Homs. And the third, an alleged chemical weapons equipment storage site and command post also near Homs. The Syrian government announced surface-to-air missile response activity. Both US and Russian sources indicated there were no civilian casualties. The UN is, however, unable to independently verify the details of all these reports. Mr. President, as Secretary General of the United Nations, it is my duty to remind member states that there is an obligation, particularly when dealing with matters of peace and security, to act consistently with the Charter of the United Nations and with international law in general. The UN Charter is very clear on these issues. Mr. President, the Security Council has primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. I call on the members of the Security Council to unite and exercise that responsibility. And I urge all members to show restraint in these dangerous circumstances and to avoid any acts that could escalate matters and worsening the suffering of the Syrian people. As I did yesterday, I stressed the need to avoid the situation from spiraling out of control. Mr. President, any use of chemical weapons is abhorrent. The suffering it causes is horrendous. I have repeatedly expressed my deep disappointment that the Security Council failed to agree on a dedicated mechanism for effective accountability for the use of chemical weapons in Syria. I urge the Security Council to assume its responsibilities and fill this gap. And I will continue to engage with member states to help achieve this objective. A lack of accountability emboldens those who would use such weapons by providing them with the reassurance of impunity. And this, in turn, further weakens the norm proscribing the use of chemical weapons and the international disarmament and non-proliferation architecture as a whole. Mr. President, the seriousness of the recent allegations of the use of chemical weapons in Douma requires a thorough investigation using impartial, independent and professional expertise. I reaffirm my full support for the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, the OPCW, and its fact-finding mission in undertaking the required investigation. The team is already in Syria. I am informed that their operations plan to visit the site is completed and that they are ready to go. I am confident they will have full access without any restrictions or impediments to perform their activities. Mr. President, allow me to repeat what I said yesterday. Syria today represents the most serious threat to international peace and security. In Syria, we see confrontations and proxy wars involving several national armies, a number of armed opposition groups, many national and international militia, foreign fighters from everywhere in the world, and various terrorist organizations. From the beginning, we have witnessed systematic violations of international humanitarian law, international human rights law, and international law tout court in utter disregard of the letter and spirit of the United Nations Charter. For 8 long years, the people of Syria have endured suffering upon suffering. Syrians have lived through a litany of horrors, atrocity crimes, sieges, starvation, indiscriminate attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure, the use of chemical weapons, forced displacement, sexual violence, torture, detention, and enforced disappearances. The list goes on. At this critical juncture, I call on all members to act consistently with the Charter of the United Nations and the international law, including the norms against chemical weapons. If the law is ignored, it is undermined. There is no military solution to the crisis. The solution must be political. We must find ways to make credible progress towards a genuine and credible political solution that meet the aspirations of the Syrian people to dignity and freedom in accordance with Resolution 2254 and the Geneva Communiqué. I've asked my special envoy to come to New York as soon as possible to consult with me on the most effective way to accelerate the political process. Thank you, Mr. President.
Doy las gracias al señor secretario general por la valiosa información que ha proporcionado. Daré ahora la palabra a los miembros del Consejo que deseen formular declaraciones. Doy la palabra al representante de la Federación de Rusia.
Благодарю вас, господин председатель.
Thank you, sir.
Россия созвала экстренное заседание Совета Безопасности ООН для обсуждения агрессивных действий США и их союзников против Сирии. Это уже пятое заседание по данной теме. Президент Российской Федерации
The President of the Russian Federation, Putin, made a special statement today, and I will quote him. On the 14th of April, the United States, supported by its ally, launched an airstrike against military and civilian targets of the Syrian Arab Republic without a mandate from the United Nations Security Council and in violations of UN Charter and norms and principles of international law. An aggression against a sovereign state was carried out, which is on the front line in the fight against terrorism. Just as 1 year ago, when the Shayrat air base in Syria came under attack, the United States used as a pretext a staged chemical attack against civilians. This time in Duma, Damascus suburb. Russian military experts did not find any traces of chlorine or any other toxic agent when they visited the site. Not a single local resident was able to confirm that a chemical attack had actually taken place. The Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons dispatched its experts to Syria in order to investigate all the circumstances. However, in a sign of cynical disdain, a group of Western countries decided to take military action without waiting for the results of the investigation. Russia condemns in the strongest possible terms the attack against Syria, where Russian military personnel are assisting the legitimate government in its counterterrorism efforts. Through its actions, the United States makes an already catastrophic humanitarian situation in Syria even worse and brings suffering to civilians. In fact, the U.S. panders to the terrorists who have been tormenting the Syrian people for 7 years, leading to a wave of refugees fleeing this country and the region. The current escalation around Syria is destructive for the entire system of international relations. History will deliver its verdict, and Washington already bears a heavy responsibility for the bloody outrage in Yugoslavia, Iraq, and Libya. End of quote. Russia has done everything possible to convince the United States and its allies to refrain from their military plans, which could lead to a new spiral of violence in Syria and destabilize the Middle East. The Secretary General of the UN, at the meeting of the Security Council that we convened yesterday and today, has expressed his concern about the way events have developed. However, in Washington, London, and Paris, preferred to disregard calls to appeals to common sense. The United States and its allies continue to demonstrate blatant disregard for international law. Although as permanent members of the Security Council, they must be especially firm in protecting the provisions of the UN Charter. It was shameful to hear how, in justifying the aggression, an article of the U.S. Constitution was mentioned. Now, we have the greatest respect to the right of each state to respect their own founding law. However, Washington should learn, it's time for Washington to learn that the International Code of Behavior regarding the use of force is regulated by the United Nations Charter. It's interesting how the people of Great Britain and France, what they will think that when they find out that their government is taking part in an illegal military adventure by referring to the American Constitution. You're constantly tempted by neocolonialism. You have nothing but disdain for the UN Charter and the Security Council, which you are unjustifiably trying to use for your illicit aims. There's no serious work that you're doing in the Security Council. You don't consult us, and you mendaciously claim otherwise. You undermine the authority of the Security Council. As a pretext for aggression, you mention the alleged use of chemical weapons in the Syrian city of Douma. Representatives of Russia, after an inspection by our experts, unequivocally stated that no such incident took place. Furthermore, there were people found who took part in this staging. And in fact, the inspirers and organizers of that staging were foreign intelligence services. After this event, the Syrian authorities immediately invited experts from the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons so that they conduct a field mission to Douma in order to establish the facts. Quickly, visa formalities were resolved and guarantees of security were provided. At the time the strikes were conducted, experts were already in Syria and getting ready to begin their work. I want to recall to the members of the Security Council and everyone else that on the 10th of April, when our draft resolution on the secure work of the special mission of the OPCW was blocked, we were assured of the fact that such a document was not necessary. We were told that the mission, without any additional efforts by the Security Council, will go visit the site and conduct an investigation of the chemical incident. Now it is clear that we were absolutely right. Yesterday, some of our colleagues, some of them naively, some of them cynically, told us that the reason of the situation is supposedly a lack of an independent investigative mechanism. The aggression has shown that that is not the issue at all, as we stated. During last year's attack against the Shayrat Air Base, there was the joint investigative mechanism of the UN OPCW that did not prevent the United States from conducting a missile strike. Afterwards, the JIM, in fact, made sure that its conclusions coincided with the reasons for the American strike. We have said many times, you don't need any investigations. You didn't need them then, and you don't need them today. The organizers of the aggression didn't even wait for the elementary establishment of facts by an international organization which is authorized to do that. They supposedly determine everything for themselves and determine who is guilty. After, given that they themselves, with the fighters that were under their control and NGOs that they control, they disseminated all kinds of rumors using social media. They confirmed this through so-called secret intelligence, mythical secret intelligence. Ladies and gentlemen, the masks, or rather white helmets, have once again fallen. We are already used to the fact that when they conduct their doubtful geopolitical policies, the countries that are aggressors already blame the regime of Assad. Lately, they tend to shift responsibility on Russia, which, according to their interpretation, cannot control the dictator. All this is based on a scheme that is that has been well tried. There's a provocation, there's mendacious accusations, a verdict, and punishment. This is how you want international affairs to be conducted now? This is hooliganism in international relations and not minor hooliganism, given that we're talking about major nuclear powers. Several strikes were conducted against the Scientific Research Center in Barza and Jamraya. Recently, 2 inspections by the OPCW were conducted with unimpeded access to all facilities. Experts didn't find any traces of activity that would contravene the Chemical Weapons Convention. The scientific facilities in Syria are used only for peaceful activity, which is aimed at enhancing the effectiveness of economic activity of Syria. You want Syria to have no economy at all? You want to throw this country back into the Stone Age? Just a few years ago, this country was one of the most developed countries in the Middle East. You want to finish off what your sanctions haven't achieved yet. At the same time, you are shedding crocodile tears about the suffering of ordinary Syrians. Well, ordinary Syrians who are tired of war and who are happy that their legitimate authorities have freed their territory are not. You're not interested in their suffering. Your aggressive actions contribute to worsening the humanitarian situation, which you are so worried about, according to your statements. In 24 hours, you could stop the conflict in Syria. For this, Washington, London, and Paris only have to give orders to their hand-picked terrorists to stop their fighting against the legitimate authorities and against their own people. The strikes were conducted against Syrian military airfields, which are being used in the course of an operation against terrorist organizations. It's quite an original contribution to the combat against international terrorism, as Washington keeps repeating, which, as Washington keeps repeating, is the only goal of its military presence in Syria. We have serious doubts about that. It seems that it's clear that those in the West who cover themselves with humanitarian rhetoric are trying to justify their action in Syria by supposedly to defeat the jihadists are actually aiming at dismembering the country. This is confirmed by the fact that the United States has refused to take part in rebuilding the areas of Syria that have been freed from the jihadists. Lastly, your aggression is a major strike and threat against the possibility of continuing the political process under the UN auspices, which, in spite of objective difficulties, was moving forward at varying speeds. So what were your constant references to the Geneva process worth if you yourselves, using your own actions, are destroying that process? We call on the United States and its allies to immediately end the aggressive actions against Syria and to refrain from them in the future. We are putting forward for your attention a brief draft resolution which we will demand a vote on at the end of this meeting. We would like to address the members of the Security Council. Today is not the time to shirk your responsibilities. The whole world is looking at you. Take a principled stand. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Mr. Secretary General, for your briefing today. This is our 5th Security Council meeting in the past week to address the situation in Syria. A week has gone by in which we have talked. We've talked about the victims in Douma. We've talked about the Assad regime and its patrons, Russia and Iran. We've spent a week talking about the unique horror of chemical weapons. The time for talk ended last night. We're here today because 3 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council acted. The United Kingdom, France, and the United States acted, not as revenge, not as punishment, not as a symbolic show of force. We acted to deter the future use of chemical weapons by holding the Syrian regime responsible for its atrocities against humanity. We can all see that a Russian disinformation campaign is in full force this morning. But Russia's desperate attempts at deflection cannot change the facts. A large body of information indicates that the Syrian regime used chemical weapons in Douma on April 7th. There is clear information demonstrating Assad's culpability. The pictures of dead children were not fake news. They were the result of the Syrian regime's barbaric inhumanity. And they were the result of the regime and Russia's failure to live up to their international commitments to remove all chemical weapons from Syria. The United States, France, and the United Kingdom acted after careful evaluation of these facts. The targets we selected were at the heart of the Syrian regime's illegal chemical weapons program. The strikes were carefully planned to minimize civilian casualties. The responses were justified, legitimate, and proportionate. The United States and its allies did everything we could to use the tools of diplomacy to get rid of Assad's arsenal of chemical weapons. We did not give diplomacy just one chance. We gave diplomacy chance after chance. 6 times. That's how many times Russia vetoed Security Council resolutions to address chemical weapons in Syria. Our efforts go back even further. In 2013, the Security Council passed a resolution that required the Assad regime to destroy its stockpile of chemical weapons. Syria committed to abide by the Chemical Weapons Convention, meaning it could no longer have chemical weapons on its soil. President Putin said Russia would guarantee that Syria complied. We hoped that this diplomacy would succeed in putting an end to the horror of chemical attacks in Syria. But as we see from the past year, that did not happen. While Russia was busy protecting the regime, Assad took notice. The regime knew it could act with impunity, and it did. In November, Russia used its veto to kill the Joint Investigative Mechanism, the main tool we had to figure out who used chemical weapons in Syria. Just as Russia was using its veto, the Assad regime used sarin, leading to dozens of injuries and deaths. Russia's veto was the green light for the Assad regime to use these most barbaric weapons against the Syrian people, in complete violation of international law. The United States and our allies were not going to let that stand. Chemical weapons are a threat to us all. They are a unique threat, a type of weapon so evil that the international community agreed they must be banned. We cannot stand by and let Russia trash every international norm that we stand for and allow the use of chemical weapons to go unanswered. And just as the Syrian regime's use of chemical weapons last weekend was not an isolated incident, our response is part of a new course chartered last year to deter future use of chemical weapons. Our Syrian strategy has not changed. However, the Syrian regime has forced us to take action based on their repeated use of chemical weapons. Since the April 2017 chemical attack at Khan Sheikhoun, the United States has imposed hundreds of sanctions on individuals and entities involved in chemical weapons use in Syria and North Korea. We have designated entities in Asia, the Middle East, and Africa that have facilitated chemical weapons proliferation. We have revoked the visas of Russian intelligence officers in response to the chemical attack in Salisbury. We will continue to seek out and call out anyone who uses and anyone who aids in the use of chemical weapons. With yesterday's military action, our message was crystal clear. The United States of America will not allow the Assad regime to continue to use chemical weapons. Last night, we obliterated the major research facility that it used to assemble weapons of mass murder. I spoke to the president this morning, and he said if the Syrian regime uses this poisonous gas again, the United States is locked and loaded. When our president draws a red line, our president enforces the red line. The United States is deeply grateful to the United Kingdom and France for its part in the coalition to defend the prohibition of chemical weapons. We worked in lockstep. We were in complete agreement. Last night, our great friends and indispensable allies shouldered a burden that benefits all of us. The civilized world owes them its thanks. In the weeks and months to come, the Security Council should take time to reflect on its role in defending the international rule of law. The Security Council has failed in its duty to hold those who use chemical weapons to account. That failure is largely due to Russian obstruction. We call on Russia to take a hard look at the company it keeps and live up to its responsibilities as a permanent member of the Council and defend the actual principles the United Nations was meant